Imagine for a second that an architect designs this absolutely breathtaking, state-of-the-art skyscraper.
Okay.
It's got, the most advanced climate control, perfect natural lighting. It's totally carbon neutral. And the interior design is just flawless.
Sounds like a pretty nice place.
Right. But the architect put the front door on the 10th floor.
Oh.
And there are no stairs. There's no elevators. If you want to get in, you have to free climb a sheer glass wall.
So you basically have a billion-dollar structure that functions perfectly for, like, the handful of people who brought climbing gear, while the other 99% of the city just stands on the sidewalk looking up at it.
Exactly. And that visual, of people standing on the ground entirely locked out of a system designed to serve them, that is the exact entry point for our deep dive today.
It's a great analogy for what we're looking at.
Yeah, so welcome to the deep dive. We are exploring a stack of writings and manifestos by Paramendra Kumar Bhagat. It's from a project called Democracy for Nepal. And his work outlines a blueprint to dismantle that sheer glass wall in digital governance. We're looking at two interconnected frameworks he proposes. One is called VoiceGov Nepal, and the other is an incredibly radical economic overhaul known as Kalkiism.
Which is quite the read.
Oh, it really is. And the core question we are trying to answer through these sources today is profound. For you listening, think about this. How does a developing nation, specifically Nepal, with its famously difficult mountainous terrain, completely bypass the traditional stages of development?
Leapfrogging, basically.
Right. How do they engineer the world's very first AI-first, literacy-agnostic, and structurally corruption-free government?
What's fascinating here is that Bhagat's blueprint, it isn't just suggesting we upgrade his servers or, build a slightly better app.
Yeah.
He is fundamentally questioning the social contract between a state and its people in the digital age. Because most governments today, even the most technologically advanced ones, they build systems that demand the citizen adapt to the machine.
You have to learn the interface.
Right. You have to learn the legal jargon. You learn to navigate the drop-down menus, figure out the forms. This blueprint suggests the exact inverse. The machine must adapt to the human being.
Okay, let's unpack this, because right now, the way we build digital governments has a massive, glaring blind spot. And the sources use Nepal as the ultimate case study to diagnose this global flaw.
It's a perfect case study, really.
It is. So let's look at the actual landscape for a second. Nepal has a population of roughly 30 million people. And if you look at their tech penetration, you would think they are perfectly primed for a digital revolution.
Oh, absolutely. The numbers are wild.
Mobile connections are over 130%.
Which means there are significantly more SIM cards active than there are actual people.
Yeah, exactly. Smartphone access is hovering right around 70%. Internet penetration sits at about 55 to 56%. And the government has even launched massive, really well-funded initiatives like the Digital Nepal Framework and the Nagarik app to digitize state services.
So on paper, the infrastructure is there. You have the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. They're pouring capital into this digital foundation. But then you run headfirst into that 10th floor door.
The literacy barrier.
Right, the literacy barrier. Nepal's overall literacy rate is around 76%.
Which is great progress historically.
It is immense historical progress. But the inverse of that statistic is the real story here. 24% of the adult population cannot read or write.
Wow.
And the geographical disparities are even sharper. If you look at rural areas, particularly among women, literacy drops to around 69 or 70%.
So the state decides to modernize, right? They roll out a sleek digital portal for land registration or health insurance.
Yeah.
But that portal is entirely text-based. It requires you to read complex legal disclaimers, understand dense bureaucratic language, input alphanumeric data.
It's essentially a test.
Yeah, if you are one of the several million adults in Nepal who cannot read the screen in your hand, that 70% smartphone penetration statistic is completely meaningless. A smartphone without literacy is just a glowing rectangle.
And this creates a severe psychological and systemic exclusion. The author argues brilliantly that a government requiring literacy to access basic services is, well, it's effectively a government running an entrance exam.
An entrance exam for your own rights.
Exactly. It says to the citizen, we will protect your rights and provide your services, provided you can pass this reading test. It takes a fundamental civic right and turns it into a conditional privilege.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though. If illiteracy is the bottleneck, shouldn't the national priority simply be aggressive universal education?
Sure.
I mean, pouring billions into fundamentally changing the government's technological architecture feels like treating the symptom. Why not just teach the remaining 24% to read?
Well, education is absolutely happening.
Huh.
But adult literacy campaigns, they take decades to achieve total saturation. And in the meantime, the demands of human survival, they don't pause for language classes.
Right.
Think about a mother in a remote village. She needs to register her child's birth today to get access to pediatric care.
She can't wait 5 years to learn how to read a form.
Exactly. A farmer needs to verify his land deed today so a corporation doesn't encroach on his property. If the system forces them to wait until they can read a legal document, they are effectively stateless in their own country.
And the reality is, people don't just give up when they hit that digital wall. They still need the service, which leads to the darkest consequence of this setup.
The shadow economy.
Yeah. If you can't navigate the website, you are forced to find someone who can. You have to rely on a human gatekeeper. You end up paying a local broker, a middleman, or flat out bribing a government official just to fill out the digital form on your behalf.
The irony is staggering, really. A digital system designed to streamline governance and increase transparency accidentally creates a massive, exploitative shadow economy. By excluding the illiterate from the interface, the state effectively mandates the existence of corrupt middlemen.
Because those gatekeepers, they are keenly aware of the power they hold. And they certainly aren't volunteering their time. They extract a toll.
Always.
And this drains the national treasury at an alarming rate. Listen to this. Nepal's corruption perception score consistently sits around 34 out of 100, which is highly problematic.
That's not great.
The national budget is roughly 14 billion US dollars. And the sources point out that administrative inefficiency and outright leakage, we're talking ghost beneficiaries collecting pensions, procurement budgets being siphoned off, files that magically disappear until a fee is paid, all of that consumes anywhere from 10 to 20% or more of all public spending.
That is billions of dollars just evaporating. And Bhagat frames this extraction in a way that reframes the entire concept of a bribe. He doesn't just call it a moral failing. He calls it a shortcut tax. In a sprawling, gatekeeper-heavy bureaucracy, corruption isn't an anomaly. It's a structural pricing mechanism. Bureaucracy acts like a slow, intentional leak in a massive water tank.
But the truly devastating part of the shortcut tax is who actually pays it. It's a highly regressive tax. A wealthy business owner pays the bribe out of their profit margin and moves on.
Right.
But for a poor citizen, this tax is paid in time. It is paid in the cost of a bus ticket to travel from a remote district to the capital city. It's paid in lost daily wages while standing in line. And frankly, it is paid in humiliation.
Oh, absolutely.
Standing in an office, begging an official to process a piece of paper that proves you exist.
And the physical geography of Nepal amplifies this tax exponentially. We're talking about the Himalayas here. Getting from a rural village to a district headquarters isn't a simple commute. It can be a multi-day journey across treacherous terrain.
Yeah.
Peer governance requires physical presence, which requires roads, bridges, and fossil fuels.
But shooting a cell signal through the air is infinitely cheaper than blasting a highway through a mountain.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the core technological pivot of the author's vision. If digitizing the paper bureaucracy just creates digital gatekeepers, the solution isn't to make the forms easier to read. The solution is to delete the forms entirely.
And that leads us to the concept of VoiceGov Nepal. Bhagat refers to it as Estonia 2.0.
Estonia 2.0.
Yeah, Estonia is often held up as the gold standard for digital societies. Their system was built for a highly literate population with ubiquitous, stable broadband. Nepal requires a different paradigm altogether. They need an interface that is voice-first and literacy-agnostic.
The sources outline a fascinating three-pronged architecture for how VoiceGov actually functions. Let's start with the foundation. Universal Digital Identity 2.0.
Right.
Nepal already has a national identity card system, but VoiceGov supercharges it by tying identity inextricably to biometrics.
Yeah.
We are talking facial recognition and voice prints. They eliminate passwords entirely.
Which makes sense.
Because if you don't read the alphabet, expecting you to remember an 8-character alphanumeric password with a special symbol is absurd.
It's a critical shift in security philosophy. Instead of proving who you are by recalling a secret string of text, you prove who you are simply by being yourself. The microphone captures the unique spectrogram of your voice, the physical resonance of your vocal cords, which is mathematically as unique as a fingerprint.
But authenticating the user is only half the battle. They still have to communicate their need to the state. That brings us to the second component, the AI voice core.
And to be clear, we're not talking about a frustrating phone tree where you press 1 for health and 2 for taxes.
Oh, I hate those.
Everyone does.
Yeah.
We're talking about sophisticated integration of advanced speech-to-text models, heavily inspired by open-source tech like OpenAI's Whisper, combined with large language models. And the crucial detail here is the localized training.
The languages, right?
Yeah, the sources envision these LLMs trained natively on over 100 local languages and dialects.
Over 100.
Yes, that localization is the magic of the system. Whether a citizen is speaking Nepali, Maithili, Bhojpuri, Tamang, or Tharu, the AI can process the acoustic input. It converts the spoken dialect into phonemes, maps those to a text string in the backend, translates that intent into a database query, retrieves the answer, and synthesizes a voice response back in the citizen's exact native dialect.
That is incredible.
The government suddenly speaks the language of the kitchen table rather than the language of the courtroom.
And the third component is what prevents this from just being an incredibly smart chatbot. They call it secure interoperability, heavily borrowing from Estonia's X-Road architecture.
Right, the data exchange.
It's an encrypted data exchange layer that forces every single government ministry to talk to each other in real time. The tax department's database syncs securely with the land registry, which syncs with the health ministry.
And the governing rule of this interoperability is the once-only principle.
The once-only principle.
Yeah. The state is legally and technologically forbidden from asking a citizen to provide information the state already possesses. You never have to bring a physical birth certificate to the passport office because the passport office queries the centralized encrypted ledger instantly.
Let's actually walk through what this looks like for a real human being, because the sources provide some incredible user journeys. Imagine a mother in the Terai region, that's the southern plains of Nepal.
Okay.
She just had a baby and needs to register the birth to secure the child's health subsidies. In the old system, she travels to a government office, finds a broker to fill out the form, pays a fee, waits weeks, travels back.
A nightmare.
Total nightmare. Under VoiceGov, she pulls out a basic $15 feature phone. She dials a toll-free short code. The system recognizes her voice print immediately. She says, "In Bhojpuri, I need to register my newborn daughter."
Just like that.
Just like that. The AI, cross-referencing her hospital records via the X-Road layer, confirms the hospital's data, asks her to state the child's name, logs the audio signature, updates the national registry, and immediately triggers the initial health subsidy payment to her digital wallet.
Wow.
The whole interaction takes 90 seconds. She never left her house.
It acts as a real-time execution engine. Another example the text highlights is civic accountability. Think about a citizen walking past a government construction site that looks abandoned.
Right.
They pull out their phone, authenticate via voice, and say, "The bridge project in my village on this road hasn't had workers in 3 months."
So they just report it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The AI logs the GPS coordinates, matches it to the procurement database, generates a public trackable complaint ID, and automatically flags the contractor's profile for review. The AI is functioning as the ultimate unbribable civil servant.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I hear that, and part of me thinks it sounds like magic. But I have to push back hard here, because anyone who has spent 20 minutes screaming "representative" at an automated airline customer service bot knows how brittle voice tech can be.
For sure. It could be infuriating.
It hallucinates. It misinterprets accents. How on earth do we trust an AI with our land deeds or our pension funds? If the system mishears a dialect and transfers my property to someone else, the consequences are catastrophic. How does VoiceGov avoid becoming a glitchy nightmare?
The author anticipates this exact skepticism. And the safeguard is the strict, hard-coded limitation of the AI's agency. This is not a generative AI freely browsing the internet to write poetry.
Right.
It is a highly constrained, deterministic interface layered over an encrypted, immutable database. When the AI processes a command to transfer a land deed, it doesn't just execute it blindly. It triggers a multi-factor biometric confirmation.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it will verbally repeat the action. It'll say, "You are requesting to transfer plot 4B to this specific ID number. Please look at the camera to confirm facial recognition and state your full name to verify voice print authorization."
So the AI is just the friendly concierge, but the actual transaction is locked behind mathematical cryptography.
Precisely. And while a human bureaucrat might misplace a file or be intimidated by a local politician to alter a record, the AI is structurally immune to those pressures. As Estonia famously concluded in their own digital transition, you cannot bribe a computer.
It has no mortgage to pay.
Exactly. It has no mortgage and it cannot be threatened.
But building a biometrically secured AI layer processing 100 languages requires massive computing power and incredibly complex software architecture. We have to look at how a nation with a GDP of roughly $49 billion affords that kind of server farm and development time.
Which is a very valid question.
And the source material makes a fascinating strategic pivot here to answer that. Nepal doesn't actually have to build the underlying architecture from scratch. They can borrow the rails from their giant neighbor to the south.
India provides the perfect blueprint here. Over the last decade, India has engineered what is arguably the most robust, battle-tested digital public infrastructure on the planet. And Phagat argues that Nepal can adopt this exact open-source architecture, specifically mirroring India's Aadhaar system and its unified payments interface, universally known as UPI.
Let's break those two down for you listening, because if you aren't immersed in global GovTech, it's hard to overstate how revolutionary they are. Aadhaar is the identity layer.
Right.
It is the largest biometric identification system in the world. It holds the fingerprints and iris scans of over 1.4 billion people. And the way it saves money is purely through deduplication.
Removing the fakes.
Yeah. Before Aadhaar, if the Indian government sent out grain subsidies, local officials would invent fake names, ghost beneficiaries, and pocket the extra grain.
But once you require a biometric scan to collect the subsidy, the fraud just collapses. You cannot scan a fingerprint for someone who died 10 years ago, and you cannot forge an iris scan for a person who never existed.
Right.
The Indian government has saved tens of billions of dollars simply by purging these ghosts from the system.
And then you pair that identity layer with UPI, the payments layer.
Yeah.
UPI fundamentally turned money transfers into a frictionless public utility. It bypasses the slow, fee-heavy credit card networks like Visa or MasterCard.
It's instant.
You scan a basic QR code on a vendor's card, and the money moves directly from your bank account to theirs instantly with zero transaction fees. It formalized millions of street vendors and small businesses overnight.
And the wild thing is, UPI is already bleeding across the border organically. Indian tourists visiting Nepal are already using UPI apps to scan QR codes at Nepali tea shops. The financial pipeline is literally already laying itself down.
So Phagat synthesizes this into a framework he calls the Trinity of Governance.
Yes. Identity, payments, interface.
Right. You establish absolute identity through Aadhaar-style biometrics. You enable instant, zero-fee financial transfers through a UPI-style payment rail. And you layer voice AI on top as the universal interface.
And when you combine these three, you achieve frictionless, uncorruptible government.
Because there's no middleman.
Exactly. If an agricultural subsidy is approved by the AI, it moves directly from the national treasury into the farmer's digital wallet in milliseconds. There is physically no point in the architecture where a middleman can insert their hand to extract a bribe.
Borrow the rail, build the train. Why spend 10 years and billions of dollars laying down new track when the open source track is sitting right next door?
Makes total sense.
But I have to ask about the geopolitical reality here. Nepal is a sovereign nation nestled between two superpowers, India and China. If I am a Nepali citizen, relying entirely on India's digital architecture feels like a massive national security risk. Does this just trade bureaucratic corruption for dangerous dependency on New Delhi?
It's a vital distinction, and the text emphasizes the difference between adopting a protocol and surrendering data.
Okay, what's the difference?
Digital rails like UPI are increasingly open-source protocols. Adopting them is like adopting the TCP/IP protocol that runs the internet. Nepal would not be storing its citizens' biometrics on Indian servers.
Got it.
They would be utilizing the mathematical standards and interoperability frameworks that India has already spent a decade stress testing on 1 billion people. It is technological collaboration. You maintain sovereign, localized databases, but you adopt the communication standards that allow seamless cross-border commerce.
Okay, so the technology is proven, the blueprints are open source, and the user experience sounds utopian. But we still have to pay for it. A $49 billion GDP means the national budget is tight. What does it actually cost to engineer VoiceGov and transition an entire nation?
The financial modeling in the source text is incredibly compelling because it shifts the entire paradigm of how we view government IT spending. The projected setup cost is estimated between 200 and 400 million US dollars, deployed over a 3 to 5 year period.
400 million is a massive chunk of change for a developing economy.
It is. But in the context of national infrastructure, it is actually a bargain. It represents less than 1% of Nepal's annual budget.
Wait, really? Less than 1%?
Yeah, it is highly affordable, particularly when you factor in the existing grant frameworks from institutions like the World Bank. But the true argument isn't the upfront cost. It is the return on investment. The text points back to Estonia, which saves roughly 2% of its total GDP every single year, purely through the administrative efficiency of digital governance.
Wait, let's do the math on that. If Nepal achieved a 2% GDP savings on a $49 billion economy, that is nearly $1 billion saved every single year.
Exactly. And that $1 billion is just the savings from efficiency, spending less on paper, less on physical office space, fewer man-hours filing documents. When you add in the reduction of outright fraud, the elimination of those ghost beneficiaries we talked about, and the massive boost in tax compliance, because formalizing a business suddenly takes 3 minutes via voice instead of 3 months of bribery.
The gains have to be huge.
The conservative estimates project $1.5 to $3 billion in net gains annually within 5 years of deployment.
That ROI is staggering. It's like realizing your house has a massive leak in the plumbing that's doubling your water bill every month. Hiring a plumber to tear out the walls and install new smart pipes costs a fortune up front. But once it's done, your bill drops permanently.
That's exactly it.
You aren't just spending money, you are buying an asset that generates revenue by stopping the bleeding.
VoiceGov explicitly categorizes this as anti-leakage infrastructure. It pays for itself entirely in the first 1 to 2 years. And the visionary part of the blueprint is what happens to that recaptured wealth.
Where does it go?
That $3 billion doesn't just sit in a state jolt. It is immediately redirected into physical reality. It builds hydropower dams to sell clean energy across South Asia. It paves rural roads. It funds universal health care and deploys AI-driven tutoring tablets to students in the most remote Himalayan valleys. The system converts bureaucratic waste directly into human development.
If the numbers are that undeniable and the technology is already functioning in neighboring countries, it begs the most frustrating question of all. Why hasn't this happened yet? If it's such a no-brainer, who is fighting it?
You have to follow the incentives. Inefficiency is not an accident. The complexity of the current system is highly profitable for the gatekeepers who control it.
Oh, of course.
Every confusing form, every mandated physical signature, every lost file is a monetization opportunity for someone in the bureaucracy. The primary obstacle is not technological. It is the entrenched political and administrative class that feeds on the friction.
The people who operate the toll booths are naturally going to fight the construction of a freeway. They're financially incentivized to keep the traffic moving as slowly as possible.
Which is why the author argues that VoiceGov cannot succeed as an isolated IT project buried in some technology ministry. It must be framed as a supreme national mission. It requires uncompromising, top-level political will, a mandate powerful enough to override the thousands of mid-level bureaucrats who will try to subtly sabotage the transition to protect their rent-seeking behavior.
And this brings us to the most intense and frankly controversial pivot in our deep dive today, because the author fully recognizes that technology alone cannot defeat entrenched human greed.
No, it can't.
If you just drop AI and digital wallets into a deeply corrupt system, the system will eventually find a way to corrupt the technology.
Yeah.
So to actually enforce VoiceGov, the text outlines the necessity of a massive socio-political earthquake. They frame it around a youth movement they call the Gen Z Kranti, which leads directly into the radical economic architecture of Kalkiism.
And as we move into this section, it is crucial to understand that the blueprint transitions from technological innovation into structural economic revolution. The mechanisms proposed here are aggressive and fundamentally alter the nature of personal finance.
Absolutely. And as a reminder to you listening, as we unpack the mechanics of Kalkiism, our goal today is not to endorse these radical economic shifts, nor are we here to condemn them. We are strictly maintaining impartiality. We are simply analyzing the architecture of the author's proposal to understand how they intend to structurally enforce a corruption-free state.
Right. We're just looking at the blueprint. So the context provided for this shift is the Gen Z Kranti, translating to uprising or revolution, dated around 2025.
Okay.
The premise is that the youth of Nepal have reached a breaking point. They are entirely disillusioned with cyclical political reform that only trims the edges of corruption. They demand a system where corruption is not just illegal, but mathematically impossible.
That's a huge distinction.
Exactly. And out of this movement emerges the Kalkiism Research Center, a consortium of economists tasked with designing this foolproof economic engine.
And the very first pillar they propose is an absolute shock to the system. Pillar 1, a 100% cashless economy. And to be clear, they do not mean launching a PR campaign encouraging people to use Apple Pay or digital wallets. They mean the state fundamentally bans and demonetizes all physical currency. Paper money ceases to exist as legal tender.
It is a stunning, authoritarian-leaning economic intervention. But the logic the KRC presents is rigorous. They diagnose physical cash as the actual bloodstream of corruption.
The bloodstream.
Yes. Cash provides an invisibility cloak. You cannot audit a briefcase full of rupees handed over in a dark parking lot. You cannot trace the $20 bribe slipped under a stack of papers to a local clerk. By entirely eliminating physical currency, you force every single transaction, every salary payout, every grocery run, every massive government infrastructure contract onto the digital ledger.
The best way I can visualize this is thinking about a city's plumbing system. Right now, it's full of leaks, but the water is clear, so you can't see where it's seeping into the ground. Banning cash is like suddenly dyeing all the water in the system neon green.
I like that.
Suddenly, every single transaction leaves a brilliant, traceable digital fingerprint. The state becomes a glass building. You can see the exact flow of every penny.
And when you fuse this 100% cashless flow with the AI, voice interface, and biometric identity of VoiceGov, the shadow economy simply collapses.
It has nowhere to hide.
Exactly. If a corrupt politician tries to siphon off $1 million from a bridge project, where do they put it? They can't withdraw it as cash. If they transfer it to a proxy digital wallet, the ledger instantly flags the anomaly and the AI traces the proxy back to its biometric owner. The physical mechanism for hiding stolen public wealth is eradicated.
But the KRC doesn't stop there. Pillar 2 goes even further and proposes the complete nationalization of all banks into state ownership. And I have to push back heavily on this. Banning cash is extreme enough, but putting the entire financial sector under the monopolistic control of the government,
It's a massive leap.
if I am a wealthy business owner or even just a citizen with healthy savings, the moment the state announces they are taking over the banks, I am immediately moving all my capital across the open border into India or converting it to offshore crypto. How does this not trigger catastrophic capital flight? And furthermore, doesn't a state bank just lead to massive political cronyism where the ruling party only approves loans for their friends?
Those are the exact existential risks of nationalization. The KRC addresses the risk of inefficiency and cronyism by pointing right back to the digital ledger. Their core argument is that in a developing economy, the inefficiency of a state bank is a far lesser evil than the systemic capture of private banks by a handful of elite families. Private banks in these contexts often function as closed-loop funding mechanisms for the ultra-wealthy to consolidate national assets rather than engines for broad economic development.
So they view the private banking sector as a monopoly already, just one controlled by oligarchs instead of the public.
Precisely. By nationalizing the banks, the state regains control of capital allocation to prioritize national development, hydropower, agriculture, infrastructure. And to counter your very valid point about political cronyism, that is exactly why the 100% cashless, transparent ledger is mandatory.
Because you can see every loan.
Yes. The transparency is the countermeasure to the monopoly. If a state bank manager approves a massive unsecured loan to a politician's brother, that transaction is instantly visible on the public blockchain-style ledger. Every loan is auditable in real time. It creates a closed-loop system of enforced accountability.
Okay, I understand the macroeconomic theory of stopping oligarchs, but let's bring this down to the individual citizen. If banks are nationalized and cash is banned, where is the upside for the average person? Because so far, this sounds like an immense amount of state control and surveillance purely for the sake of stopping corruption. What is the economic incentive for the citizen to accept this?
That brings us to Pillar 3 of Kalkiism, and this is where the framework offers a profound society-altering paradigm shift. Pillar 3 mandates zero interest on all citizen savings deposits.
Wait, hold on. I put my hard-earned money in the bank and the bank pays me 0% interest.
Yeah.
Inflation is going to eat my savings alive. Why would anyone willingly participate in that?
You have to look at what the state does with the aggregated capital. In traditional fractional reserve banking, the bank takes your deposit, loans it out at a high interest rate, keeps a massive chunk of that profit for its shareholders, and gives you a tiny fractional percentage back as your interest. Kalkiism short-circuits that profit model. The state bank still pools all national capital and loans it out to industries, manufacturers, and infrastructure projects. Those entities still pay interest on the loans.
But the state doesn't keep the profit.
Exactly. The state doesn't keep it as profit, and it doesn't distribute it as individual micropayments to depositors. Instead, the state aggregates all of that interest revenue and uses it to fund a massive, localized welfare engine.
Oh, wow.
The interest generated by the nation's collective capital is used to guarantee universal free education, universal free healthcare, and free legal services for every single citizen.
That is a massive conceptual leap. You check your banking app at the end of the year, you see you've earned 0% interest, the number hasn't moved, but then you realize your mother's cancer treatment was entirely free.
Exactly.
You realize you didn't have to save a single rupee for your kid's university tuition because the state covered it. If you get sued, your legal defense is fully funded. It essentially replaces the concept of individual financial yield with a guaranteed social safety net.
And the author is very careful to frame this not as charity or a traditional welfare scheme funded by punishing income taxes, but as a social dividend.
A social dividend.
Yeah, it is a fundamental right derived from the citizens' participation in the national economy. It transforms the banking sector from an extraction machine that primarily benefits the wealthy into a localized welfare engine that benefits everyone.
It's an incredibly fascinating ideological shift. But my skepticism here comes down to human nature. We are deeply culturally wired by global capitalism to expect a direct, personal, individual return on our capital. Telling a society, give up your personal interest for the collective good, feels like a monumental cultural hurdle.
It is a massive hurdle. It demands that the citizen place absolute trust in the state to manage the collective yield of their labor fairly. And historically, as we've discussed, trust in the state in Nepal is incredibly low, due to the exact corruption they are trying to fix.
Which is the catch-22.
Exactly. This is why VoiceGov and the digital transparency must come first. The state can only ask for that profound level of financial trust if they can mathematically guarantee through cryptography and open audit trails that the revenue is actually going to hospitals and schools, not into a politician's offshore account.
Which naturally leads us to the darkest timeline of this blueprint, because anytime someone pitches a utopian vision of a 100% cashless, AI-run, state monopoly economy, the red flags don't just go up, they catch on fire. We have to talk about the threat of a digital prison.
The author is highly cognizant of these existential risks. A fully digitized, cashless state creates a central point of failure that is arguably the highest value target for hackers on the planet.
It's a honeypot.
A massive one. The cybersecurity threats are staggering. If a state-sponsored hacking group breaches the central bank ledger, or if a massive earthquake knocks out the national power grid, a cashless society doesn't just face an inconvenience. The entire nation physically stops functioning. You can't buy bread, you can't buy fuel.
And even if you secure the perimeter against hackers, the threat from inside the house is just as terrifying. If every single transaction is digitally logged, the government has a panopticon. They know who you donated money to, what books you bought, what train you took, and exactly where you were at 2:00 p.m. on a Tuesday.
Yeah, the surveillance potential is absolute.
You are one bad election away from an authoritarian surveillance state using that data to crush political opposition.
Without ironclad, technologically enforced safeguards, a digital utopia inevitably devolves into a digital cage. The text explicitly outlines the mitigations required to prevent this. Nepal would need privacy frameworks that make Europe's GDPR look lenient.
What does that look like in practice?
The first principle is aggressive data minimization. The state is legally and architecturally restricted to keeping only the data it absolutely needs for a transaction, and it must purge the rest.
So they don't build a massive data lake holding your entire life history.
Correct. The second vital safeguard is strict access logs. In Estonia, for example, a citizen can log into their portal and see exactly which government official accessed their medical or tax records down to the second.
That's amazing.
If a police officer pulls your file without an active investigation, you can flag it, and that officer faces criminal charges. The state is legally bound to answer, who looked at my data?
Transparency going both ways.
Yes. Furthermore, the blueprint mandates independent oversight commissions, cyber judiciaries, that are completely firewalled from the executive branch and political interference.
I understand the legal safeguards, but what about the physical realities of the infrastructure? We talked about the illiterate being left behind by paper, but what about the people who fall through the digital cracks?
Right, the digital divide.
What happens to the elderly citizen who outright refuses to use a smartphone? What happens to the rural trader in a Himalayan pass where the cell towers go down for a week during a monsoon? If cash is illegal, how do they survive?
It is a critical vulnerability. You cannot build a system that assumes 100% perfect connectivity in one of the most rugged topographies on Earth. The author argues that VoiceGov must be engineered with an offline-first architecture.
Offline first.
This means the system relies on fail-safes, like USSD and IVR.
Let's unpack those terms for everyone because they are crucial to making this work in the real world.
Yeah.
USSD stands for Unstructured Supplementary Service Data. It's essentially the protocol you use when you type a short code like *123# into a basic flip phone to check your prepaid balance.
Exactly.
It doesn't use internet data, it uses the voice signaling channels of the GSM network. So even if the 4G data network is down, if you have even a sliver of basic cell reception, you can execute a transaction.
Right.
And IVR is interactive voice response, basically an automated phone tree.
Exactly. And beyond basic network tech, they propose Edge AI.
Okay, what is that?
This means deploying solar-powered kiosks to remote villages, where the voice recognition AI is stored locally on the machine's hardware. The local kiosk processes the transaction, updates the local ledger, and then waits until a satellite or cellular signal is caught to batch sync with the national database. The transaction completes locally without needing continuous live internet.
That solves the connectivity issue, but it still doesn't solve the human reluctance. Can a solar-powered kiosk really replace the nuance and empathy of human governance for a marginalized person who is terrified of the machine?
Technology alone cannot bridge a gap that wide. The transition requires what the text calls community ambassadors.
Human beings.
Yes, actual human beings. Local teachers, youth leaders, stationed at these kiosks, not as gatekeepers who charge a fee, but as guides. They help the elderly and the marginalized interface with the AI until the cultural adoption takes root. It requires immense human empathy to guide a society across that technological chasm.
We have covered an absolute mountain of information today. We started by diagnosing the fatal flaw of modern e-governance, that invisible wall of illiteracy that locks 24% of Nepal's adults out of their own state, forcing them into an exploitative shadow economy where they pay a shortcut tax and bribes and time.
We then explored the technological cure, VoiceGov Nepal, an AI-first interface powered by biometrics and LLMs trained on 100 local dialects, allowing citizens to bypass paperwork entirely.
Right.
We looked at how Nepal can accelerate this by borrowing the proven open-source rails of India's Aadhaar and UPI to secure identity and make payments instantly frictionless.
And then we went deep into the radical economic restructuring required to enforce it, the framework of Kalkiism. Banning physical cash to turn the shadow economy into a glass building, nationalizing banks to prevent elite capture, and implementing a zero-interest social dividend that redirects national capital yields into guaranteed free healthcare and education for all.
It's a massive sweeping vision.
It really is. All of it protected, theoretically, by rigorous data minimization and offline first edge computing.
Stepping back, the global implications of Bhagat's blueprint are profound. If Nepal successfully engineers this, they stop being a nation that imports Western political systems. They transform into a massive GovTech exporter.
Oh, interesting.
They could open source this exact blueprint for the entire global South. Nations across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia facing similar literacy and infrastructure challenges could adopt VoiceGov. Nepal could become the foundational model for inclusive digital democracy in the 21st century.
And that leaves me with one final, deeply unsettling thought. It's not explicitly written in the source material, but this entire deep dive has me thinking about it. I want you listening to really mull this over. If a developing, resource-constrained nation like Nepal has the blueprint to engineer a system where corruption is structurally, mathematically impossible, what does that say about the wealthy, highly developed nations of the world?
It's a great question.
Nations that have unlimited server farms and endless capital, but still rely on physical cash, massive tax loopholes, and sprawling, confusing bureaucracies. Are our systems overly complicated because we lack the technology to fix them? Or are they overly complicated because the people in power actually benefit from the shadows those complexities create?
When you realize the technology to build a transparent state already exists, the absence of that transparency becomes a very loud, very intentional choice.
So the next time you interact with a massive, beautifully designed system, whether it's filing your taxes, applying for a permit, or paying a medical bill, ask yourself, where did they put the front door, and who exactly was it built for? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, keep looking for those hidden doors, and we will see you next time.